Admiral Zheng He is coming!
History books sometimes lie, and sometimes they just prefer to forget. We were taught in school that the age of exploration began in 1492 with Christopher Columbus's famous 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. But let me tell you a secret. If you were a fisherman living in the Indian Ocean in 1405, decades before Columbus was even born, you would probably think the apocalypse had arrived upon seeing the sight on the horizon. Because what was coming toward you wasn't 3 wooden boats. The horizon line was completely blocked. Emerging from the mist was a floating city made of bronze and wood, something that even modern engineers might ask, how did they make this float? Let's make a comparison so you understand the situation better. The length of Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was about 19 meters. Now, hold on tight. The treasure ships of Zheng He, whose story we are about to tell, were over 120 meters long. Let's put the math this way. You could fit Columbus's entire fleet into just the cargo hold of Zheng He's ship, and you could add a football field next to it so the crew wouldn't get bored. This colossal power sailed from China all the way to Africa. He dethroned kings, cleared the oceans of pirates, and transported giraffes like house pets. But then, as if he never existed, he was erased from history by his own country. Today, we will tell the story not just of a sailor, but of a man who rose from castrated slavery to become the world's most powerful admiral, the story of dragons, and an empire that burned its own ships. Here is the forgotten giant of the oceans, Zheng He. Every good story begins with a tragedy. Just like Batman losing his family, Zheng He's story was written in blood. His real name was He, and here is an interesting detail. He wasn't ethnically Chinese. He came from a Muslim family of Central Asian descent. They lived in the mountainous and wild Yunnan region in the south of China. His father and grandfather were Hajis. That is, they were a fairly intellectual family who knew the world for that time. However, when the year 1381 came, He's world came crashing down. The newly established Ming dynasty in China entered Yunnan with a massive army to clear the last remnants of the Mongol Empire. Ming meant bright in Chinese, but the only thing they brought for He was darkness. His father was killed in this war. The 10-year-old He was captured by the invading soldiers. And the horrible, irreversible procedure that was applied to child prisoners of war at that time was also performed on him. He was castrated. Let's not dismiss this as just a historical detail, because the key to He's rise lies here. Although eunuchs seemed like the most despised class in Ming China, they were actually the most critical backdoor of the system. They could not have families, and they could not have children. Thus, they posed no risk of starting their own dynasty. This is why emperors entrusted their lives to eunuchs, while they distrusted bureaucrats and generals. He was assigned to the service of a young prince, Zhu. And something that defied biology happened here. It is often said that castrated men tend to be more delicate in structure. But He, on the contrary, grew up like a physical anomaly. Records write that he was nearly 2 meters tall, walked like a tiger, and his voice boomed like a temple bell. He was intelligent, he knew martial arts, and most importantly, he became Prince Zhu's most loyal friend. Years later, when Prince Zhu started a bloody civil war against his own nephew, asking, "Why shouldn't I be emperor?" that giant man was at the forefront of the armies. The war was won. Prince Zhu had become Emperor Yongle, and as a reward for this loyalty, he bestowed a new surname upon He. He was no longer He. He was Zheng He, the emperor's sword. When Emperor Yongle ascended the throne, he had a problem. He had seized the throne by force through a coup. He needed to prove his legitimacy. He needed to tell not just China but the whole world, "I'm the boss." At that time, China was already a superpower on land. But Yongle's vision was beyond the horizon. He summoned Zheng He and gave the famous order, "Bring me the world." Thus began the largest industrial project humanity had ever seen in the Nanjing shipyards. Billions of dollars were spent in today's money. Thousands of acres of forest were destroyed. The resulting fleet was like the Star Trek fleet of the Middle Ages. A total of 317 ships. A crew of 28,000 people. Think about that number. 28,000 people. This was more than the population of many European cities at the time. The men had established a floating metropolis in the middle of the ocean. The technology of the ships was 500 years ahead of its time. For centuries, Westerners said, a wooden ship cannot be that big. It would break its back in the ocean. But Chinese engineers had a secret: watertight compartments. They divided the ship's hull into sections, like the internal structure of a bamboo stalk. Even if the ship was pierced in one place, the water would only stay in that compartment, and the ship would not sink. This technology would not reach the West until centuries later. The fleet was not just composed of soldiers, doctors, translators, astrologers, mathematicians, and most interestingly, farmland ships. The biggest killer in long sea voyages was not war, but scurvy. That is, vitamin C deficiency. While European sailors were dying with their teeth falling out, Zheng He's soldiers were growing bean sprouts in soil-filled pools on the ships, eating fresh vegetables and drinking green tea. Logistics wins wars. And Zheng He wrote the book on logistics. When this massive fleet first set sail in 1405, the goal was not just to say hello. It was a demonstration of power. It was the message, "We are here and we are bigger than you." When the fleet descended south into the waters of modern-day Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they found a problem: Chen Zui. Chen Zui was the most feared pirate king of the era. He had extorted tribute from the Strait of Malacca. He thought himself so powerful that instead of fleeing when he saw Zheng He's fleet, he thought, "These are laden merchants. We will rob them." It was the biggest mistake in history. When the pirates attacked, hell literally rained down from Zheng He's ships. The Chinese had succeeded in turning gunpowder into a weapon at that time. They turned the pirate fleet into wreckage within minutes with primitive hand grenades, flame-throwing tubes, and gunpowder arrows. 5,000 pirates were killed. The pirate king Chen Zui was captured alive, packaged, and taken to Nanjing to be executed in front of the emperor. After this event, all the kingdoms in the Indian Ocean got the message: Zheng He is not to be trifled with. But not everyone learned their lesson right away. On the third voyage, the fleet stopped in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon. The island was home to Buddhist sacred relics. The king of Ceylon, Alagonakara, saw the Chinese fleet as a threat. He planned to trap Zheng He on land and then loot the ships in the harbor. Zheng He was cut off from the main body of his army on land. The king's soldiers had surrounded him. Most commanders would panic here. But Zheng He was a strategic genius. He realized that the king had driven all his soldiers into the forest to capture him. What did this mean? The capital and the palace were defenseless. Zheng He secretly broke through the siege with his elite unit of 2,000 men, rushed in the opposite direction, and raided the capital. At dawn, the king of Ceylon was captured in his own palace, in his own bed. Zheng He packaged this country's king and took him to China. Emperor Yongle pardoned the king and sent him back to his country. But the terms had changed. Everyone in that ocean now knew who to pay tribute to. Zheng He's voyages were not just about blood and gunpowder. The main goal was commerce. Chinese porcelain, silks, and tea were the most valuable currencies of the era. Kings showered them with gifts wherever they went. The most interesting event occurred on the coasts of Africa. When the fleet reached the coasts of modern-day Kenya and Somalia, the locals presented them with an animal they had never seen before. A long neck, spotted skin, horns. A giraffe. But for the Chinese, this was not just a giraffe. In Chinese mythology, there was a legendary sacred creature called the qilin, which only appeared during the time of virtuous emperors. The sailors went wild when they saw the giraffe. "Behold the qilin, proof of our emperor's sacredness," they said. The poor giraffe was loaded onto the ship. When it arrived in China, the palace erupted. The emperor personally went out to the palace gate to greet this sacred creature. This was the peak of Zheng He's career. He had brought not just gold, but divine approval. Let's also make a side note here about Zheng He's personal life. Remember, Zheng He was a Muslim. When they reached the Arabian Peninsula during these voyages, he anchored his ships at Jeddah. Although he could not go himself, he sent his attendants to Mecca for the Hajj pilgrimage. He had pictures of the Kaaba drawn and took them to the emperor. A monument stone he erected in Sri Lanka, the Gal inscription, is still in a museum today. On this stone, prayers are offered in Chinese to Buddha, in Tamil to Shiva, and in Persian to Allah. That is, the man was projecting a global citizen vision with a tolerance that we cannot even achieve today, back in the 1400s. Seven major voyages. 28 years of dominance. The world was in their hands. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The lights went out. Why? We have reached the turning point that changed the course of history. Zheng He's biggest supporter, Emperor Yongle, had died. His son and grandson who succeeded him were not as visionary as their father. But the real problem was the Confucian bureaucrats. These bureaucrats viewed merchants and sailors as an inferior class. To them, China was the Middle Kingdom. It was the center of everything. There was nothing to learn outside. The outside world was only barbarism and expense. A power struggle had begun in the palace. The bureaucrats were rebelling. These voyages are draining the treasury. Giraffes do not fill stomachs. The Mongols are attacking again in the north. We should spend the money on the Great Wall. In fact, the voyages were profitable thanks to trade, but the issue wasn't money. It was ideology. They did not want China to open up to the outside world. In 1433, while returning from his final voyage, 62-year-old Zheng He died at sea. The giant of the oceans was buried in his home, the sea. With his death, the bureaucrats took their revenge. They did not just stop the voyages. They closed the shipyards. They left those magnificent treasure ships to rot in the harbor. Some were dismantled. And the most tragic part, they burned all the logbooks, the maps, all the detailed records that Zheng He had kept. Minister Liu Daxia told someone who asked him for the maps, "Those documents were just unnecessary papers that deceived people. I burn them all so that our ancestors may rest in peace." In the following years, the empire issued an edict. Building a ship larger than 2 masts is an act of treason and punishable by death. China thus cut its own wings with its own hands. Historians call this the Great Divergence. Just a few decades after Zheng He was stopped, Portuguese and Spanish sailors on the other side of the world set sail in their small, fragile ships. They filled the seas that China had left empty. What would have happened if China had continued? They probably would have rounded the Cape of Good Hope first. Perhaps those giant dragon ships would have reached the shores of the Americas before Columbus. Perhaps today, people in California would be using place names of Chinese origin, not Spanish. Perhaps the Industrial Revolution would have started in Nanjing, not London. But these are all maybes. What is certain is this: it is not enough to have technology, power, and money. One must have vision. Zheng He was the giant of the oceans. But his biggest enemy was not the waves or the pirates, but the cowardice in his own court. His ships were burned, and his maps were destroyed, but his story, no matter how deep it was buried, managed to surface. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this forgotten giant of history, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It's not as big as a treasure ship, but it means the world to us. See you in the next video.